Well, Civil War was #1 at the box office this weekend, and we proved once again today that the only place we're ever going to have a civil war is on the screens in the movie theaters where that film is playing. Donald Trump would love to have a civil war of sorts over the criminal prosecution that he's facing now in Manhattan. He would probably love to have what he would call, his term, a bloodbath, or something like what we saw on January 6th, an uprising that could shut down the courthouse, stop the proceedings maybe. But once again today, as I just said, Donald Trump got nothing. And he knew he was going to get nothing from his supporters, which is why he didn't make the public mistake of summoning them to Manhattan to gather outside the courthouse, a mistake that he did make 1 year ago when he was arraigned at that same courthouse, and no one showed up to try to block that proceeding the way they tried to block the certification of Joe Biden's Electoral College win on January 6th. A year ago, April 4th, 2023, Donald Trump pleaded not guilty in that courthouse, and he pleaded with his followers to be there. But I walked down to the courthouse to see the crowd that gathered to support Donald Trump. It was a smaller crowd than I expected. I expected a small crowd. It was still smaller than that. The news media far outnumbered the Trump protesters then, all of whom were well behaved, the protesters, I mean, as I expected. And I said then on this program that you had nothing to worry about with Trump supporters trying to cause trouble or violence at Trump trials. And we have more proof of that today. The criminal court where Donald Trump is being tried is in a campus of courthouses that include federal courts and state courts, all kind of close together. And in roaming the campus today, I found no more than a couple dozen Trump supporters and maybe more anti-Trump demonstrators, all of whom were very peaceful and usually very, very quiet. So peaceful and quiet that babies were sleeping in the shadow of a courthouse. Literally, babies sleeping. That was the first photo I took this morning on my morning walk to the Trump courthouse, the sleeping babies. And according to reporting in the New York Times and the Washington Post tonight, babies were not the only sleepers in the neighborhood. Maggie Haberman, who was in the courtroom, reports for the New York Times under the headline, "A weary Trump appears to doze off in courtroom." Former President Donald J. Trump seemed alternately irritated and exhausted Monday morning as his lawyers and prosecutors hashed out pretrial motions before jury selection in his criminal case. Mr. Trump appeared to nod off a few times, his mouth going slack and his head drooping onto his chest. The former president's lead lawyer, Todd Blanche, passed him notes for several minutes before Trump appeared to jolt awake and notice them. Under the headline, "Trump seems to nod off briefly as prospective jurors get instructions," the Washington Post reports, quote, "Former President Donald Trump closed his eyes and at times appeared to nod off Monday afternoon in a Manhattan courtroom as prospective jurors were instructed on what they would need to do to serve on the jury in his hush-money criminal trial. Trump closed his eyes several times. He then abruptly caught himself and stiffened his posture. His attorneys, Todd Blanche and Emil Bove, refilled his drink and gave each other an awkward look at the defense table." Awkward indeed. Unfortunately, the trial is not televised, so we have no video confirmation of the 77-year-old criminal defendant falling asleep in court. The trial will not be televised, and the revolution will not be televised because they didn't show up. Not only are Trump voters no longer willing to violently revolt for Donald Trump, they will not even show up at his criminal trials. There are actually 85,000 Trump voters living just on the island of Manhattan, and none of them bothered to go down to the courthouse today. None of the Trump supporters I spoke to there are from New York. Other press accounts quote Trump supporters from Pennsylvania. So if you include eastern Pennsylvania and say driving distances of an hour and a half from that courthouse, there are several million Trump voters who live on Long Island and Connecticut and New York State and New Jersey and Pennsylvania, who could easily have been at that courthouse today. Millions of them. But they don't care that much about Donald Trump. They'll vote for him, but they won't revolt for him. They won't even show up for him. And so Donald Trump has given up asking them to even show up at his trials. And instead today, he just asked them for money. Money he told them he would never need when he began running for president, and promised to pay for his campaign himself because, as he said then, quote, "I am very rich." Today, he asked for what he called 1 million patriots to send him money because he desperately needs it, because he's not rich enough. But he didn't ask for any patriots to come to his courthouse because he knows they won't come. They just won't come. And that is a very good sign about just how stable this country actually is tonight. The first words Donald Trump heard in the courtroom today were from the clerk saying, "This is the people of the state of New York versus Donald J. Trump." The judge immediately denied the latest Trump motion, asking the judge to recuse himself. Judge Juan Merchan then moved on to some scheduling issues, saying he was not yet sure about a scheduling request. Quote, "Regarding counsel's request that the court adjourn on Friday, May 17th for Mr. Trump to attend his son's high school graduation, and Friday, June 3rd to allow a member of the defense team to attend their son's graduation, I cannot rule on those two requests at this time. It really depends on how we are doing on time and where we are in the trial. If everything is going according to schedule without unnecessary delays, then I am sure we will be able to adjourn for one or both of those days. But if we are running behind schedule, we will not be able to." Of course, if Donald Trump had been more interested in spending time with his son in the first months of his son's life, instead of spending time with Stormy Daniels in those days, Donald Trump would definitely be available for his son's high school graduation this year. Donald Trump's son was 4 months old when Donald Trump spent an evening with Stormy Daniels that he just as easily could have spent with his 4-month-old baby if he cared enough about that baby. In 1982, the New York State Supreme Court ruled on the case of People versus Parker, which established what has become known as the Parker warnings that a judge must give a defendant. Before the potential jurors were called into the courtroom, Judge Merchan gave Donald Trump the Parker warnings that he gave him when he was actually arraigned in that courtroom a year ago. The judge said, "Although you've already had the Parker warnings, I am going to repeat them at this time now that we're at a different stage of the proceedings. Today, we're going to begin to pick a jury. So these Parker warnings take on special significance. You have the right to be present during the trial. And that is an important right. It permits you to assist in your defense, to assist your attorneys in their defense of you. Do you understand?" Trump, "Yes, sir." The judge, "You can, however, on your conduct, lose that right to be present. If you disrupt the proceedings in any way, the law permits the court to exclude you from the courtroom and commit you to jail and continue the trial in your absence. Do you understand?" Trump, "Yes." The judge, "If you deliberately fail to appear here for trial, that will constitute a forfeiture of your right to be present. A warrant will be issued for your arrest. The trial will continue in your absence. And if there is a verdict of guilty and you again fail to appear for sentence, you will be sentenced in absentia. And upon your arrest, a sentence will be executed and you will be subject to separate prosecution and separate punishment for bail jumping, no matter what happens in this trial. Do you understand that?" Trump, "Yes, sir." The judge, "Thank you." 96 potential jurors were called into the courtroom. More than half of them were immediately excused after saying that they could not be impartial in the case. Of the 34 potential jurors who remained in the courtroom, 9 completed answering every question on the judge's 42-question list. when things are just cranking up. We saw a bunch of rulings before any of those jurors were brought into the room to go through those 42 questions. What was established by the judge in those rulings before the jurors came in?
One of the very interesting things about those rulings, Lawrence, was, of course, Trump has spent the lead up to this trial trying to discredit Judge Merchan and has been saying how unfair he is, how compromised he is. And what the judge did was created very provisional rulings that in many instances were favorable to Trump. He ruled that Trump, at least at this stage, prosecutors cannot mention one of the facts that you mentioned in your opening, that he had conducted this affair while his wife was pregnant. The prosecutors cannot mention also that with the affair with Karen McDougal, that took place before the pregnancy with Stormy Daniels. It was after the pregnancy. In another ruling, Justice Merchan had said that that prosecutors cannot show the tape from the Access Hollywood tape that precipitated the campaign being in a tailspin, but the prosecutors can describe it. These were very detailed rulings. The judge is very clear to observe the due process rights of the accused and also giving the prosecutors a lot of runway to expand on their broader theory of the case, which is that this was an effort to influence the 2016 election, showing that this isn't only about one payment, that this was about an effort with the release of the Access Hollywood tape to put out a bunch of scandals. And he really threaded that line carefully and in detailed form.
Just to go to one of these rulings that the judge made at the pretrial stage to show how tentative they actually are. This is the ruling he made about not mentioning, the prosecution should not mention that Melania Trump was pregnant while the Karen McDougal affair was going on, for example. And so the judge says, at this moment, I think that the prejudicial value of that definitely exceeds any probative value. As you know, we never know how evidence will come in, what will happen on cross-examination, whether any doors will be open. But for purposes of why we're here today, at this moment, I don't believe that that is necessary. And Andrew, that seemed to be the note on many of these evidentiary rulings, that at this moment, we don't anticipate allowing that. But then he makes the point that, hey, on cross-examination, who knows, things can happen.
Yeah, that's very standard in these sort of what are called in limine pretrial motions, where a judge will say what both sides can do and what they cannot do for the moment. But then, depending on what arguments and what evidence each side decides to bring out, they can, as Adam said, open the door to evidence that was previously held to be unduly prejudicial. It can become relevant because it's unfair for one side to then make an argument that could be responded to by the other side, but for that pretrial ruling. So, for instance, if, they were to say, well, the transcript of the tape where the tape itself is not being allowed to be played, if for some reason the defense were to make some argument that the transcript's inaccurate or it doesn't reflect what Donald Trump actually said on the tape, that would open the door. I don't suspect that the defense lawyers here, who are very experienced, will do that. Will open the door to it. But it's really typical to have these kind of preliminary rulings to set the ground rules for both sides.
Andrew, now that we have the transcript, I guess we've had our hands on this transcript for over an hour or so of literally every word said in the courtroom today. Is there anything in that transcript, now that we actually know every word said in the courtroom, that jumps out at you?
Well, I think Adam's point that the judge is being fair has made rulings that were favorable to one side or the other, depending on what particular facts are. That struck me as a very good sign. I think he is no nonsense. For instance, the government made the argument that they still have not received discovery from the defense. The defense has to produce any documents that they intend to use in the case to defend themselves. And if they don't do that, they should be precluded. And what the judge did is said, you know what, you have 24 hours to produce that. No more games. If you do not produce every piece of evidence that you intend to use, it's precluded. So I thought that was a very strong, definitive ruling by the judge. So I think he is going to run a very tight ship. He strikes me as somebody in the mold of Judge Kaplan, the judge who had the two E. Jean Carroll cases. So I think we're going to see a very efficient trial being conducted here.
Adam, I've been in courtrooms where every minute of the day where when I finally see the transcript, I notice something that I didn't notice in the room because it moves at different speeds and sometimes you don't hear every word. Was there anything in that transcript after you got to review it where it kind of underlined or added to your understanding of what you were hearing?
Well, I would say the proximity of those Parker warnings that you showed viewers a little bit earlier. Now, as you noted, these are warnings that the judge must give. Yeah. And in most instances, when the defendant is not the former president of the United States, would be quite mundane.
Yeah.
But it's quite extraordinary in this instance. And two things struck to me when I was reading it in the transcript. One, it was around the time that Trump reportedly fell asleep. I mean, this is toward the end of the morning session. This is a time when most reporters were observing him nodding off. It's a striking thing to see the proximity between that moment and a former president of the United States being read these extraordinary things, a warning that he could be tried in absentia if he is disruptive, and that he could, warning about bail jumping, that this followed a kind of, it's both extraordinary and totally mundane. And that was what jumped out at me from a close read of the transcript.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. In any other case, I would not have bothered to read the Parker warning, standard issue. I just wouldn't have bothered. But he's saying this to a former president, and all these references to, we will come and arrest you for this, we'll arrest you for that, we'll arrest you for that.
Hey everyone, MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.